The granite was cold under my fingertips. I remember that detail specifically. The way the kitchen counter felt that morning, smooth and gray and completely indifferent to what was happening on top of it. It was a Tuesday in March. The twins were at school. The house was quiet in that particular way it gets when something irreversible is about to happen and the walls already know it. Daniel slid the papers across to me without looking up. No preamble. No conversation. Just a manila folder, a pen set on top of it, and 7 words delivered like he was reading off a grocery list. "You'll get nothing, Karen. Sign the papers." I looked at him for a long moment. Then I picked up the pen. And I smiled. Not because I was broken. Not because I had given up. Because 8 months earlier, I had started preparing for exactly this moment. And Daniel had no idea. My name is Karen Whitfield. I'm 39 years old, and for the last 11 years I lived in a 4-bedroom home in River Oaks, one of the most expensive zip codes in Houston, Texas, with a man who genuinely believed that because he earned the money, he was the only one who understood it. He was wrong about that. He was wrong about a lot of things. Before I became a full-time mother to our twin boys, Marcus and Miles, 8 years old, the 2 best things that ever happened to me. I was a corporate paralegal at a mid-size litigation firm downtown. 7 years. I worked discovery on financial fraud cases. I organized asset trails for attorneys who billed $600 an hour. I learned how money moves when people are trying to hide it, and I learned what documentation looks like when it's built to survive a courtroom. Then I met Daniel, fell in love with Daniel, and eventually left my career to raise our sons while Daniel grew his regional logistics company. That was the agreement. That was the life we built together. What I didn't fully understand at the time was that Daniel had filed that transition away in a specific part of his mind, the part that would one day tell him I had become dependent, decorative, and easy to dismiss. I ran our household finances. I managed our investment accounts. I filed our taxes every April with the same precision I'd used in that litigation office downtown. I reviewed our quarterly statements. I knew our net worth to within a few $1,000s, or so I thought. Because here is what I also knew, the thing I had noticed quietly and said nothing about for almost 3 years. The numbers didn't always add up. Not dramatically. Not obviously. Just enough to leave a small, persistent shadow at the edge of every statement I reviewed. I had filed that shadow away too. Until the night I stopped filing and started looking. I want to be precise here because I think precision matters when you're describing something that took years to fully name. Daniel was not a man who screamed. He was not the kind of husband who broke dishes or left bruises. What he did was quieter than that. And in some ways because of that quiet it took me longer to see it clearly. The first thing he did was language. Early in our marriage, whenever I'd raise a financial question, "Why is this account down? What is this transfer? Can we talk about the investment strategy?" Daniel would smile in a specific way. Patient. Slightly tired. The smile you give a child who has wandered into an adult conversation. "Karen, I'll handle it. That's not something you need to worry about." First I accepted that. He was building the business. He was busy. I had 2 infants and a household to manage. But that phrase, "that's not something you need to worry about," became a wall between me and my own financial life, and it was constructed so gently I barely felt it going up. The second thing was social. Daniel had a group of friends, business owners, a couple of attorneys, their wives. We had dinner with them 4, maybe 5 times a year. And Daniel had a habit at those dinners of making me the punchline of a gentle joke. Never cruel enough to call out directly. Always wrapped in affection so that if I reacted, I'd be the one who couldn't take a joke. "Karen handles the household budget. She's very thorough, she'll audit you if you underpay for drinks." Laughter. My smile tightening by a millimeter. "She used to be a paralegal, so she reads every contract, including our marriage certificate, twice." More laughter. Daniel's hand on my shoulder. The warm performance of a loving husband. I learned to laugh along. But I also learned to remember. The third thing, the one that took me the longest to name, was the $40,000. In the fall of 2021, we renovated our kitchen. New countertops, custom cabinetry, a full appliance replacement. I budgeted $28,000 from our joint renovation fund, which I managed. But the final invoice was $41,500. When I asked Daniel where the additional $13,500 came from, he told me he'd moved funds from his business operating account as a short-term loan to the household. I'll rebalance it next quarter. Don't worry about the mechanics. I didn't push, but I pulled the bank statement. And the transfer he described, a clean line item loan from the business account, wasn't there. The money had come from somewhere, but it wasn't where he said it was. I kept that statement, folded it, put it in a manila envelope in the back of my home office filing cabinet, and told myself I was probably misreading it. I wasn't misreading it. What they didn't know was that envelope would eventually become the first thread in a financial trail that a forensic accountant would follow all the way to a Delaware LLC, and straight into a Houston courtroom. That should have been the end of my suspicions. It wasn't. There is a specific kind of humiliation that happens in a room full of people who like you. It's worse than being humiliated privately, because privately you can absorb it, reframe it, file it away. But publicly, in front of people whose opinions you've quietly valued for years, it lands differently. It lands like a verdict. It was a Saturday evening in October. We were at Robert and Diane Heller's home in Bel Air. A dinner party, 8 people. The kind where the wine costs more than most people's grocery budget, and the conversation stays carefully pleasant until it doesn't. We were midway through the main course when Daniel's business partner, Greg, made an offhand comment about a property investment going sideways. He was frustrated. The numbers had shifted, the return wasn't there, and he was venting the way men like Greg vent, loudly, performatively, expecting sympathy. Daniel shook his head and said, "That's the thing about real assets. You have to actually understand them to manage them." Then he looked at me and smiled. Karen thinks managing a household budget is the same thing as financial strategy. I keep telling her, "Sweetheart, it's a different game." The table laughed. Lightly. Reflexively. The way people laugh when they're not sure if something was a joke, but the alternative is awkward silence. Smiled. I lifted my wine glass. I said nothing. But something left me in that moment. Some last reserve of patience I hadn't realized I'd been spending down for years. What made it worse, what made it irreversible, was what happened 20 minutes later, when I slipped away to find the bathroom and passed the open door of Robert's home office. Daniel and Greg were inside. They didn't see me. I heard Greg say, "So the Delaware structure is still clean." And I heard Daniel say, "Completely. She doesn't know anything about it. Never has." I stood in that hallway for 4 seconds. Maybe 5. Then I walked to the bathroom, ran cold water over my wrists the way my mother taught me when I was a child and needed to calm down quickly, and looked at myself in the mirror for a long time. I drove home alone that night. Daniel stayed for another hour. "Don't wait up, I want to catch up with Robert." And I sat in our kitchen in River Oaks, in the house I had spent 11 years building into a home, and I made a decision. No more filing things away. No more folded bank statements in the back of a cabinet. No more smiling at the table while my own financial life was being managed in rooms I wasn't allowed to enter. I opened my laptop. I found the name of a forensic accounting firm I had used on a discovery case back in 2009. I wrote down their number. Then I went to bed. And for the first time in a long time I slept through the night. That was the moment everything shifted. Her name was Priya Anand. She ran a forensic accounting practice out of a firm on Westheimer Road. 12 years in financial litigation, former IRS consultant, the kind of professional who speaks in complete sentences and never uses the word probably. I called her on a Monday morning in November while the twins were at school. She picked up on the second ring. I told her I was a former paralegal. I told her I had 11 years of marriage, joint tax returns, 2 business entities, and a feeling I could not yet quantify. She said, "Can you get me 3 years of bank statements, your joint tax returns, and any business documentation you have access to?" I said, "I can get you 5 years." She said, "Then let's meet Thursday." I want to explain something about what I brought to that meeting, because I think people sometimes imagine this kind of discovery as dramatic. Hidden safes, encrypted files, some cinematic moment of revelation. It wasn't like that. It was paper. Years of paper I had kept because I am, at my core, a woman who keeps records. Joint account statements going back to 2019. Tax returns for 2020, 2021, and 2022. The incorporation documents for Daniel's logistics company, which I had a legal right to access as a co-signatory on our joint filings. And that original folded bank statement from the kitchen renovation, the one where the transfer didn't match the story. Priya spent 3 weeks with those documents. What she found was this: a Delaware LLC registered in 2019 under the name of Daniel's business partner Greg, but with Daniel listed as a beneficial owner in a secondary filing. 2 business checking accounts tied to that LLC. And a pattern of transfers. $4,000 here, $7,500 there, occasionally larger sums, that moved money out of Daniel's logistics company and into that LLC over the course of nearly 4 years. Total undisclosed amount, $312,000. In Texas, marital assets are community property. It does not matter what you name the LLC. It does not matter that your partner's name was on the registration. If those funds were generated during the marriage, they belong to the marriage. And the court takes a very specific view of spouses who attempt to conceal them. Priya put her pen down after walking me through the final summary and said simply, "He should have had a better accountant." I thought about that dinner party in Bel Air. About Daniel's hand on my shoulder. About the word sweetheart used as a closing argument. I picked up my phone and called a divorce attorney. 22 years practicing family law in Harris County. A wall of case results behind her desk that she never pointed to. She didn't need to. When I sat down across from her and slid Priya's forensic report across the desk, she read the first 4 pages without speaking, looked up once and said, "How long have you been building this?" I said, 8 months. She nodded slowly, the way a surgeon nods when the pre-op imaging is cleaner than expected. "Don't file yet," she said. "I want 90 more days." That is the part of this story that people don't expect. Because when most people imagine a betrayed spouse who has just discovered $312,000 in hidden assets, they imagine confrontation. Tears, accusations, a thrown folder, a slammed door. I didn't do any of that. I went home. I made dinner. I helped Marcus with a science project about the water cycle and read Miles 3 chapters of a book about a boy who befriends a lighthouse keeper. I kissed my sons goodnight and sat across the dinner table from Daniel while he talked about a contract negotiation in Beaumont. And I listened, and I nodded, and I gave him nothing. Because Sandra had explained something to me that my paralegal training had already understood, but my emotions needed to hear out loud. The moment he knows, the assets move. Delaware structures are fast to modify. Give me time to freeze them first. So we froze them. Sandra filed a motion with the Harris County District Court. Not a divorce filing, not yet. A financial preservation order, the kind used in complex asset cases to prevent dissipation while litigation is pending. It required Priya's forensic report as supporting documentation, which we submitted under seal. The court granted it in 11 days. What that meant practically: Daniel could not move, transfer, restructure, or liquidate the assets tied to that Delaware LLC without triggering a court violation. The accounts were effectively locked. He didn't know this yet. He had not been served. Nothing in our household had changed. I remember the exact sound of that ordinary Tuesday. Miles arguing with Marcus about whose turn it was on the iPad, Daniel's keys dropping on the entryway table at 6:47 p.m., the timer on the oven clicking, and thinking. He has no idea. The second thing Sandra had me do was documentation. Every contribution I had made to the marital estate needed to be recorded. 11 years of household management, financial administration, and co-parenting, translated into something a judge could review in 40 minutes. I spent 3 weekends building a contribution log, a 47-page document that itemized my labor, the investment accounts I managed and their growth rates under my oversight, the household budget I maintained, the child care coordination, the school enrollment, the medical appointments, the tax preparation. Texas community property law already entitled me to half of everything earned during the marriage. But Sandra said the contribution log would matter for custody, for the tone of the proceedings, and for the judge's overall picture of who had actually been running this household. Judges are human, she told me. They respond to specificity. I gave her specificity. The third piece was the financial advisor. Daniel had a personal financial advisor, a man named Thomas who had managed his premarital investment portfolio and continued to handle a portion of our joint accounts. Thomas and I had always had a civil, professional relationship. I had attended every annual review meeting. I had asked questions Daniel always slightly resented. Thomas, it turned out, had documentation of his own. Records of conversations where Daniel had explicitly asked him to route certain distributions away from joint accounts. Thomas had flagged this internally at his firm as a compliance concern 18 months earlier. His firm's compliance officer had noted it and taken no action, but the record existed. Sandra subpoenaed it. By the time Daniel was served with divorce papers on a Wednesday morning in late January, handed to him in the parking lot of his logistics office by a process server while 2 of his employees watched from the building entrance, the architecture was complete. The forensic report, the preservation order, the contribution log, the subpoenaed compliance record. He walked into that courtroom carrying 7 words. We walked in carrying 471 pages. I want to tell you about the morning of the first hearing. It was a Thursday in late February. I wore a navy blazer I had owned since my paralegal days. Fitted, structured, the kind of thing you put on when you need to feel like yourself. I dropped Marcus and Miles at school at 7:45, drove downtown, found parking on Louisiana Street, and walked into the Harris County Civil Courthouse with a rolling file case and Sandra Okafor beside me. Daniel was already in the hallway when we arrived. He was standing with his attorney, a man named Clifford Marsh, who had a reputation in Houston divorce circles for aggressive asset protection strategy. Clifford was tall, silver-haired, expensive in the way that announces itself. Daniel had mentioned him twice in casual conversation over the preceding months, both times with the particular satisfaction of a man who believes he has already won. Daniel looked at me across that courthouse hallway. Then he looked at my rolling file case. Then he looked at Sandra. Something moved across his face that I had never seen there before. It was the beginning of understanding. Clifford Marsh had built Daniel's defense around a straightforward premise. Karen is a non-working spouse with no independent income, limited financial sophistication, and no claim beyond standard community property division of disclosed assets. That strategy collapsed on the second day. When Priya Anand took the stand as our forensic expert and walked the court through the Delaware LLC, the registration documents, the beneficial ownership filing, the 4-year transfer pattern totaling $312,000, Clifford objected 3 times. The judge overruled him 3 times. When Sandra introduced the subpoenaed compliance record from Thomas's firm, the documented internal flag of Daniel's explicit request to route distributions away from joint accounts, Clifford requested a recess. The judge gave him 15 minutes. Daniel used those 15 minutes to have a very quiet, very intense conversation with Clifford in the corner of the hallway. I didn't need to hear it. I could read it in the geometry of their bodies. Clifford's shoulders angled forward, Daniel's arms crossed and then uncrossed and then crossed again, the particular stillness of a man being told that the ground he was standing on is not what he thought it was. What they didn't know was that we hadn't even introduced the contribution log yet. The settlement came before we needed a third hearing. I think Clifford was experienced enough to understand that continuing was only going to cost Daniel more. Financially, reputationally, and in the eyes of a judge who had now seen 4 years of deliberate asset concealment documented in clinical, irrefutable detail. Here is what the final order contained. The family home in River Oaks, a property valued at $1.4 million at the time of filing, was awarded to me outright. Daniel had argued it should be sold and split. Sandra argued that continuity of residence for the twins made transfer the appropriate remedy. The judge agreed with Sandra. Daniel's 401k, which had grown to approximately $580,000 during the course of our marriage, was divided. I received 60%. That was $348,000. Transferred via qualified domestic relations order within 90 days of the final decree. The $312,000 in the Delaware LLC, every dollar of it, was classified as undisclosed marital property and included in the community estate. Clifford attempted to argue that the LLC structure constituted a legitimate business separation. The forensic report made that argument very difficult to sustain. The court divided those assets accordingly. I was awarded primary physical custody of Marcus and Miles. Daniel received standard visitation, every other weekend and alternating holidays. The judge's language in the custody section of the order was brief but precise. It cited the stability of the primary residence, the consistency of the primary caregiver's role, and the best interests of the children. Daniel paid Sandra's legal fees in full. That was $47,000. And Clifford Marsh, the best divorce attorney in Houston, billed Daniel approximately $93,000 for a case he did not win. I remember sitting in Sandra's car in the courthouse parking garage after the final decree was signed. She had a bottle of sparkling water in her cup holder and she handed it to me without ceremony, which was exactly right. She said, "You know what won this?" I said, "The forensic report." She shook her head. The forensic report was the weapon. What won this was the 8 months before it. The discipline. The fact that you never tipped your hand. Thought about that. About every dinner I had sat through. Every smile I had held in place. Every night I had closed my laptop and gone to bed and said nothing and waited. People talk about revenge like it's a burst of heat. An explosion. Something fast and loud and satisfying in the immediate moment. That is not what this was. This was cold. This was patient. This was 11 years of being told I didn't understand money, being used as the audience for someone else's confidence, being managed and minimized and kept at the edge of my own financial life, and then one morning deciding that I had, in fact, been paying attention the entire time. Daniel called me 6 weeks after the final decree. Not to apologize. I want to be clear about that because I think some part of you is waiting for the apology and I don't want to give you something that didn't happen. He called to ask if I would consider modifying the visitation schedule so he could take the boys to his company retreat in Galveston in April. I said I would review the dates and get back to him. I did. The dates worked. Said yes. Because here's the thing I had to learn. The thing that took longer than the forensic report, longer than the court filings, longer than any of it. The point was never to destroy Daniel. The point was to stop being destroyed by him. There is a difference. And for a long time when you are in the middle of something like this, that difference is very hard to see. Because the anger is real, and the injustice is real, and the humiliation of standing in a courthouse hallway while a silver-haired attorney tries to argue that you have no claim to the life you spent 11 years building, that is real too. But destruction is not the same thing as justice. And justice, when it arrives through the correct channels, through documentation and patience and the specific provisions of Texas community property law, justice is quieter than you expect. And more complete. I live in River Oaks. My sons go to the same school they have always gone to. Every morning I drive them, and every morning Marcus argues that Miles got the better seat, and every morning I listen to them and think, this is what I protected. Not the house. Not the 401k. Not the $312,000 that a Delaware LLC tried to swallow. The ordinary Tuesday morning of it. The continuity. The fact that my boys will grow up in the same home, with the same mother, in the same life. And none of that was taken from them because I paid attention when someone hoped I wasn't. I keep the forensic report in my home office. Not because I need it anymore, but because sometimes when I am doubting myself, the way women who have been managed and minimized learn to doubt themselves. I opened the first page and I read Priya's summary paragraph, and I remember. I knew. I had always known. I just needed time to prove it. If you have made it to the end of this story, I want to say one thing to you directly. If there is someone in your life, a partner, a parent, a sibling, a business associate, who has spent years making you feel like you don't understand your own situation, I want you to hear this. Understanding is not the same as speaking. You may have been quiet. You may have smiled at the table when you should have stood up. You may have folded bank statements and put them in cabinets and told yourself you were probably misreading things. You probably weren't misreading anything. And it is never too late to start documenting. If this story resonated with you, tell me where you're watching from. I read every single comment. And if you've ever been told you'd get nothing, by a person, by a system, by a room full of people who underestimated you, I hope you remember that was never the truth about you. It was only ever the truth about what they needed to believe. If you're going through something similar right now, a divorce, a financial dispute, a situation where you feel like someone has more power than you, the single most important thing you can do today is document. Write it down. Keep the receipts. Open a folder. You don't have to know the full plan yet. You just have to start. If this story helped you feel less alone, please subscribe. I share stories like this every week. Leave a comment below. And if you know someone who needs to hear this right now, share it with them. Sometimes the most powerful thing we can give someone is the reminder that the quiet ones are rarely the ones who lose. I'll see you in the next one.